we'll work our way through here and just talk about all the ins and outs of vegetable gardening in raised beds. And the premise of this evening, when Gloria and I were talking about it, was we're assuming that there are people who have always wanted to have raised beds and just haven't got it done, are still maybe trying to answer a few questions about whether it's for them or not. Maybe have raised beds that they're delighted to have, as I find most raised bed gardeners are, and happy to share some information around. Or maybe you've got raised beds and are having a little some troubles with it, and or looking for a few answers. So I'm hoping that tonight we can run through all the decision-making pieces, lots of photos to help you get some ideas, and then at the end maybe share some of suggestions that you have got. So I think the first question has to be, why do people garden in raised beds? And at the top of the list often is that they look great. And in talking to people, when I ask them, why did you build your beds instead of just gardening in the ground? Often one of the first things they say is, well, they just look really nice and they enjoy gardening in them. So I think that's a great reason to do it. Someone I was talking to said it appeals to people that like to have nice straight lines and everything in neat order. So that can be another good reason too. They're easy to work in. So if you've got any mobility issues, or some of us are not bending down as low as we used to, so that can be an advantage. They are a great way of improving the soil. So particularly if you have got very poor soil, whether it's very sandy or it is a very clay kind of soil that seems to be difficult to work with in the ground, then a raised bed is a way to bring in new soil and also to improve it. They tend to warm up faster, so that means you can plant earlier, and the plants typically will grow faster, at least at the start of the season, because the soil is warmer. And in our climate, in our short season, that is a definite bonus. And often you can plant them earlier because they are up out of the ground when the snow starts melting, it melts off of there first. So another good reason to get up high. Less compaction, you're not walking back and forth in those beds or not driving equipment over it, so that makes them easier to work and easier for the plants to grow. This season that we've got right now, I would say access in wet weather has got to be a real bonus. So in this garden, on the photo down at the bottom, you can see even if it was really wet, because of those nicely mulched beds, you could still get out and work the garden, do some picking of weeds or harvesting of vegetables. So that can be a big advantage. I find, certainly in my garden, one of the big places where things go wrong, you can have the garden all in good shape and then we get a week or more of rainy weather and you're not there to take care of it, and things seem to just suddenly go out of hand. You can plant them very intensively. That seems to work well because you don't have paths within those beds, and you can get up close, so do that fine weeding and thinning that's necessary. They're easy to fence, so whether it's a case like this garden that's got a beautiful chain link fence around it, so that could be done regardless of the kind of garden you have, but sometimes people like to put a fence just around the beds for a variety of reasons. One of them may be to keep pets out of it. Easy to put some frost protection or netting over top of those beds because they're easy to attach to them. And a big bonus for a lot of people is if you've got young children, sometimes it's hard for them to know where the garden starts and stops and where the rows are. And sometimes the dogs don't seem to be able to figure out what those sticks at the end of the rows mean, and so they wander around, and the beds make that pretty obvious. So lots of good reasons for having raised beds. I did want to mention that some of these are not exclusive to raised bed gardening. You can plant intensively in the ground. You can use strategies to warm up the soil, although that's not as easy in the ground. So I would say that there are a lot of great advantages to raised beds, but it doesn't mean that that is the only way to garden. So as always, there are lots of options. This beautiful head of bok choy, took a photograph of that this morning. So someone who's a friend of mine who has a beautiful set of brand new raised beds, she put transplants in quite some time ago and has already harvested that out of her garden. And that's because she was able to work that bed early and the soil was nice and warm. On the bottom of the screen is a photo of a bed in the ground that has been hilled up to make mounded beds. So there's another strategy where you can actually raise the level of the soil in a regular kind of a garden. So it can work that way as well. And as we'll find, a lot of people that have raised beds also have an in the ground kind of beds as well, just because different crops maybe are suited to better kinds of gardening. So just because you have raised beds doesn't mean you have to give up that other garden space. So, of course, there are so many different kinds of raised beds made out of many, many different kinds of materials, all different shapes and sizes. If ever you go onto Pinterest and do the search for raised beds, sometimes there's too many suggestions there. I must say, sometimes too, I find some of them are just very unrealistic as well. And that's a bit of what I'd like to talk about tonight is let's find a design that works for us, for our climate and our gardens. I'm assuming that a lot of people here tonight have a larger yard, maybe on a rural property, and space is not the reason that we're raised bed gardening. And so let's find the size that works for us and a style that is actually practical for what we want. So we'll have a look at all of those different beds and talk a little bit about them and more. If you are thinking about raised bed gardening and don't know where to start, or you're wanting to change what you've got or add to it, there are a lot of decisions to be made, and we'll work our way through those decisions. So first off would be, what are you going to make those beds out of? Then you need to know how much size, how much gardening space do you need to accomplish the goals that you have to feed your family, or have enough fresh carrots to last you till the end of August, or whatever it is your goals are. Think a little bit about if you're having more than one bed, where you're going, how much space do you need in between, how you're going to prepare the site before you build the bed, what you're going to put in it as far as soil goes, and what kinds of crops you're going to grow. And maybe for some people, that's the fun of it, is that planning and daydreaming about what you can do. So materials people use, I would say wood is probably the most common. Sometimes people use metal or stone or concrete. I've seen some pretty nice temporary raised beds built with straw bales. It doesn't get much easier than that. So I would say that the size of the beds are often partly determined by what materials you're using. And so I have a couple of examples here of different styles of beds based on the kind of materials they're using. This photo on the right-hand side is from the community garden at the Multicultural Center in Stony Plain. They've got a very nice setup, and I took a lot of photos there to get some ideas and see what people were doing. So you'll see more photos of it. And so how do you decide about what materials to use? Well, it'll depend on, again, what your goals are. What have you got to spend on those beds? I'm sure we've all seen the gold-plated high-end version of a raised bed you might have that none of us are going to have in our gardens. How long do you want those beds to last? Is looks important to you? Maybe a lot of people go with what materials are available. They're repurposing something else. Or maybe there's just certain materials you like to work with. So lots of choices there. So here's an example from Multicultural Center and how that bed that you can see in the photo is built. So they use, the beds are 4 feet wide by 8 feet long. The timbers that they're using are 4-inch, so 4x4s. So these beds are built with frames that are built individually level by level, so 3 of them all together. So the total height on that bed is about 12 inches. So you can see that size is chosen because they've taken those 8-foot timbers, and to make the end pieces, they've cut one of them in half, so you get it 4 feet wide. So that's a pretty nice measurement, and as you see some more photos of these beds, you'll get an idea of what quantity of crop you can put in there. So it uses 9 timbers for one of those beds, and at $12 a piece, that's $108 for that one bed, and they are spaced 2.5 feet apart. Now, Multicultural Center has got a great big field, so space is not of a concern to them whatsoever. So that gardener that produced that beautiful bok choy that has just built her beds, she used 14-foot pieces of lumber that are 12 inches high. So she just uses 2 boards per bed, cuts 3 feet off, and makes the beds 3 feet wide and 10 feet long. And you might be asking, what happened to that extra foot that's missing? She made the bed 3 feet wide instead of 4 feet wide because she likes to work from one side of the bed. Although she can access it from all sides, she likes to sit on one side and reach all the way over to the bed from that one side. And so with 2 boards per bed, it costs her $50. She's got 2 feet between the beds, and she finds that that's plenty of room to get her wheelbarrow through and to kneel down between the beds. And she built 8 beds in her phase 1 of her garden and spent about $300 for topsoil to put in there, that she also added other materials to, amended it, and added some lasagna materials that we'll talk a little bit about. And her goal, so trying to decide how many beds do you need, her goal is to have 16 beds altogether, and that's just to feed her husband and her son. So she is one keen gardener. So I think it really is important for you to know how much you need in the way of vegetables to feed yourself and what you're going to do with them. She does a lot of canning. So these are Harold's hugelkultur beds. So this is a person that wasn't a gardener up until a couple of years ago, and all of a sudden got bitten by the bug and has built several of these long beds. They are about 3.5 feet high, and they are going to last forever and ever. And they grow everything in there. And the reason it's called hugelkultur, the whole principle behind hugelkultur is that you start off with a layer of very coarse woody material in the bottom. So typically they are just built in the ground. Well, actually, typically you dig a trench and you throw the wood into there and then layer on materials after that. So this is a little unconventional in that there's nothing below the ground. It starts right in these beds. But you can see all the aspen growing in the background on that acreage property. They cleared an area, so there was all of this wood. They just hacked it up into pieces and threw it in there and then started filling it with manure and compost and then finished off with soil on top. And those were very productive beds, and it's quite a sight to see. And these beds are made out of stone and concrete. The stone bed below is from a garden in the Merthorpe area, one of the yards that we visited during the Rural Beautification Contest one year, or the Rural Beautification Tour. And so it's stone and cement holding that all together. That is a bed that's going to last for a long, long time. And the beds up above are using a set of connectors that Lee Valley Tools happens to sell and other stores do. So you can just see those little green connectors. And so that's using patio blocks. You build a foundation with lumber at the bottom and affix those clips and just slide the blocks into there. And this is the bed that grows outside the store in Edmonton. And it's a beauty. I think they're very attractive. I'm thinking that economically they're not too bad because you can get the patio blocks at a good deal. And if at some point you don't want to raise bed anymore, you can disassemble it and you still got some patio blocks. Nice advantages of both of these beds is that stone and concrete will collect some heat and make those beds even warmer. Couple more stone-based beds. This one on the left-hand side is also at the Multicultural Center. So again, you'll get some nice heat on that. I would say that maybe sometimes people have stone in surplus from a project they were working on, or maybe something they built that's been disassembled, or somebody I was just talking to today did a house and a garage renovation and he found 300 bricks buried in his little residential lot. Maybe there are these paving kinds of stones looking for a home that you might come across. So the bed on the right-hand side is beautifully done. It's really a lovely bed, is very productive. They've put flat stones on the top, as so many of these beds have something flat on the top so that you can sit down on the edge and work in the bed. And it is up against a south-facing wall, so there's lots of nice heat there to grow those beautiful vegetables. And again, lots of other materials. So the bed on the top of the screen is the community garden or the school garden at Darwell School. And they're made out of some kind of a synthetic wood material, plastic kind of wood. And I think they were very easy to put together. These are using bed connectors, again, that you can buy at garden supply stores. And one of them is falling apart, and I didn't have a good close look at it, and I don't know whether it was just a case of maybe it got dinged by a wheelbarrow going back beside it. But you do need to think about the sturdiness of the containers and how they are going to last. And there's another one of those kind of beds, plasticky sort of beds that are, you put them together, it takes you 20 minutes and the job is done. And typically a lot of these pre-made ones are done in standalone units that can be connected one together after another, and you can make that bed as big as you would like. So I would say the more commercial the materials, probably the more expensive they're going to be to build, but all good ideas. And then when you start talking to gardeners, you get many examples of people using what they have or something that somebody's given them or they found it at the transfer station. So this used to be a deck on this house, and they found that they never used the deck, so they took it all apart and turned it into a raised bed, which you can't see as an L-shaped bed. So it extends back to the house. And that seems like a very productive use of a deck that wasn't being used as it was meant to be. So just an aside on this photo, this bed is from the Fallen Four Memorial in Mayerthorpe, and it is made out of recycled election campaign signs. So that seems like a good second life for that lumber. It also gives you a good example of heights of beds. So those are 2x4s, and so I am assuming that that bed is about 18 inches high, and you can see how much she's bending over or not needing to lean into it to harvest it. So it gives you a bit of a sense of what might work for you. And I just noticed looking at this photo this afternoon, look at that lovely big water tank right next to that flower, right next to that vegetable bed, which is a key piece of putting a location in mind for your garden. It should be somewhere it can access water. And that water is being collected off of the roof of the Fallen Four building, so that there's a lot of water coming off of that nice big building. So how big do you make them? I think just about anything you read on raised beds will tell you that a good average size is about 4 feet wide. And the notion there is that you can reach halfway into that bed at that width. So I would say if you are not convinced, go and visit some gardens and stretch your arm across it and think about how you would use it. Sometimes beds are built so that you can only access it from one side. And so 3 feet seems to work well. I had a lovely visit in Gloria's yard on the weekend, and her bed is about 3.5 feet wide, she thinks, and that's just a little bit too wide. Sometimes she has to get her knee up on that bed. So 3 feet seems to work. So how deep? I think this is a very important question to answer. I see people building beds that are 6 inches high, and I'm sad because I think that's just not deep enough unless you are prepared to cultivate the soil beneath and have the plants growing into the soil. But I think for most people, one of the reasons you are not so great, or you're putting it in a place where you normally wouldn't have a garden, but if you have a raised bed, then you can have a gardening space there. So making it too shallow is going to be a bit of a struggle. The one thing I didn't list in the advantages of the raised beds, I didn't want to start off on a low note, but there are some disadvantages of raised beds, and cost might be one of them, but that they do dry out fairly quickly because that soil is raised up and warms up and heats up faster and is more exposed to the air perhaps. So having a shallow bed is going to be a bit of a challenge in a dry year to keep it moist. So I would say 12 inches minimum. And if you've got good soil below, then you know that the plants can grow into that soil. And so that gives you a little extra depth. For a lot of people, 2 feet is maybe what they would aim for. So often we're kind of in between 18 inches, 2 feet. But I've certainly seen beds that are taller. And particularly if the person that is gardening has a mobility problem, you want a level that is easy to reach from perhaps a walker or a wheelchair. Or if bending over is the issue, then high enough that you don't need to bend over for it. And then how long do you make the bed? So again, maybe it's based on the lumber that you've got, if that's how you're building it. I think mostly what you need to think about is getting access. If you've got very long beds, then you need to be piecing your lumber, and then also you need to walk a long way down to the end of the bed if you want to get over to the other side, because typically people don't walk across their raised beds. So when you're having that conversation about what are you going to make the beds out of, the question might be, how long do you want them to last? And often there is a trade-off. So of course, nice cedar will last you maybe up to 25 years. It looks beautiful, it smells nice, it's nice to work with, but it's going to be more expensive. You can make raised beds out of just regular lumber that's not been treated. It could be fir or spruce or whatever else is available. Well, we just did some work at Peg Garden using tamarack rails, and it is hard wood. We've got some old rails there that have been in the ground for a long time. So I guess if you could find some tamarack lumber, that might be a good use as well. So yeah, cedar is a great wood to work with, but it tends to be a little expensive. So then another option, well, so just going back to that, I would say, usually they say cedar lasts about 25 years. People that have built beds with regular kind of lumber find that it lasts for them maybe for 8, 9, 10 years. And chatting with somebody yesterday who built beds with that kind of lumber, she said after 10 years, it's probably time to do a little refit anyhow, and it's not such a big deal to lift that soil out, rebuild the bed, put a new one in. And in fact, they have just done a lot of renovations at the Multicultural Center and have replaced 35 or more beds. And they went through a really interesting process of doing kind of a lasagna layering in the bottom of the beds as they built up the new soil. And they took the old frames and put them in the bottom, so that wood wasn't lost. And so if you've got wood that hasn't been treated, it can go back into the bed. So that's one option, and just say to yourself that 10 years is a good long run for a bed, and you can rebuild. Then there also is the option of using pressure treated wood, and a lot of people are quite shy of using pressure treated wood, and I would say that if it is of a concern to you at all, then don't use it, because it will be on your mind at all times. But they have changed the kind of materials that are being used for pressure treating wood. And I would say that research shows fairly clearly that it is safe to use for vegetable garden beds. And I will reference a podcast later on at the end of this session by Joe Lampel. And in that podcast, he references a research paper that was done by the University of Illinois that goes into a lot of details about whether pressure treated wood is okay to use. And so if you'd like to do some research, it's available. The other possibility is some people will line the beds with plastic just to give themselves another layer of confidence of using that kind of wood. So then the other thing that I realized that makes a good sense is that if you use thick wood, like a 4x4 piece, then it's going to take a lot longer for it to deteriorate away. So that can be another way of using the same kind of construction techniques and get a bed that lasts a good long time. So those are some of the things to think about if you're using wood. And of course, if you're using other materials like metal, then it will last a long time. So on the left-hand side is a set of raised beds using railway ties. So that's what people used to use. They were often very easy to get a hold of. And then we started to realize that that's probably not a good choice. And now you don't find railway ties in many places. So the railways, for instance, when they are decommissioning pieces of a railway line, that wood goes straight up to Swan Hills for safe disposal. They used to be able to buy them. They would sell them off, but they don't anymore. So that's typically not what people are using anymore. You can see the corner of this beautiful newly built bed. It's got a nice pepper plant nestled in there and lined with plastic. So some people will line it with plastic for a couple of reasons. One, to make it last a little longer. The other is if it's outside and around grass, it maybe helps keep weeds from penetrating the bed as well. So your choice. Some people find that it's not worth the effort to do it, that often that plastic gets nicked and water gets in anyhow. But so again, kind of your choice. Those beds up at the top, that is the Garden Bed for TV program that Joe Lampel does down in the States. Those are all made out of 4x4 cedar timbers, gorgeous looking beds, and they are there for a long time. So there are lots of ways to go about it. So how much space do you need? And so I was taking photos at the community garden a little while ago, and a young boy bicycled up on his bike and he said to me, "You've got a really nice garden." And I thought for a minute that he thought that was my whole garden. And so we had quite a delightful conversation. He actually had a garden bed here in Stony Plain for a couple of years, and then they got some beds at home. And his comment to me was, well, I asked him what crops he was growing. And he started listing off many, many crops. And he said, and that's just in 2 beds that we have. And I don't know how big they are, but I'm assuming they're not much bigger than this. But he felt that that was truly a garden's worth of vegetables that they grew. And on the right-hand side, I just happened to be there when a gentleman came along to water his garden bed. And so I asked him, and he said last year he had one of those boxes. So these boxes are 4x8. And then he said, I really got into pickling last year, so they needed to have a second bed this year that they are renting, so that he had enough room to grow more cucumbers for pickles. So that just gives you a bit of a sense of what you can grow in that space. The garden on the left-hand side, you can see how many different crops they've got in there. I know if a lot of rural gardeners, if you had a great big garden, then you're going to need more than 1 or 2 beds, but maybe you're wanting to make your garden space more manageable, maybe something that you can actually enjoy and keep on top of. So this could be a good starting point. So I've got a few photos of different gardens, and I kind of labeled them as to how they came to be. And this one came from we look in gardening magazines. We see great ideas, and sometimes we say to someone else in the house, look at this picture, could we have something just like that? So that's how this garden came about. And this gardener also has a space where she plants potatoes in the ground. And I think that that is a solution a lot of gardeners have come up with. As I've talked to them, they have their raised beds, they put very specific crops in there, and then they also have another space where maybe something like potatoes that take up a lot of room, that are a little easier to keep weeded because it's a pretty robust go in with a hoe, get it going kind of a bed. And this gardener also has a greenhouse with raised beds in there too. So there's lots of ways to go. It doesn't mean you have to be one kind of gardener or another. And we will look at some of those beds again a little later. So how do you put those beds together? I am impressed with the many, many ways that the beds can be constructed, and there are lots of resources for plans on how to build it that tell you how many nails you need, what kind of lumber to get, what the dimensions are, or you can just wing it based on knowledge that you already have. So just a few examples, starting up at the top left-hand corner. That's a plate that is being used to screw together those beds that are in the multicultural center. So they are 3 rows. So they build the frames 1, 2, 3 and stack them up. And then, as you can see on the next photo over to the right, sometimes people will drill holes all the way through and then stick a piece of rebar in there. So that rebar, you can just see in the corner, is in each corner of the bed, and it goes right down into the ground. So what it's doing is it's tying all of those 3 layers of lumber together and also holding it in place in the garden. And the advantage of that is that if somebody's working away in the garden with a shovel and really digging deep, which you might end up doing if there's a lot of quackgrass in there, sometimes if that bed isn't anchored to the ground, it might shift the bed, and you don't want that happening. Now, if it's fairly tall and it's full of soil, it's not likely to shift, but sometimes when it gets wet, it can bow out. So there are a lot of reasons for anchoring it. The bed on the bottom left-hand corner has got different kinds of, rather than square ends on it, it's got mitered corners on it, so it fits very neatly, looks quite tidy. And if you look deep into that bed, you will also see that there are pieces of 4x4 in each corner and also midway along the bed on the inside. So that is what the lumber is anchored to. And so it gives you a good sturdy, rigid frame. And the bed on the top right-hand corner has got big, hefty posts in the corners and also on down the sides, because that is quite a long bed, and so it's supporting the boards so that they don't get a wow in them as the beds get older. And then the one at the very bottom, that's that cedar bed, and they've used lag bolts to put it together, which is a nice way to do it. And if you've got a good sturdy drill, those lag bolts just zip in there in no time. And you can see that they're countersunk so that the lag bolts aren't sticking out and won't catch you on the knee as you walk by. And with the lag bolts, the other advantage, this gardener said, is that if they want to dismantle it, they can just back those bolts back out and take it all apart, move it somewhere else, or use that lumber for something else. Just another reminder as well, if you are using pressure treated wood, you need to make sure that you use galvanized hardware on it. So these are the kinds of details that when you go to the lumber store to pick up what you're getting, just make sure you get all the details so that you can do it right. Okay, so we have decided how we're going to build them and where we're going to build them. And no, we haven't talked about where we're going to build them. We'll talk about that in a minute. So what do you do? How do you prepare the site? So you need to start level. You don't need to, but it really makes sense to level it out. So spend a little bit of time doing that. Dig down a little bit if you need to level something off so that you've got nice level edges. I'm sure you will appreciate it when you look at it from a distance. The question is, do you cultivate in or amend that native soil? Are you gardening right down below the bottom of the bed or not? And we'll talk a little bit about that. I do think it's very important in most cases that you should remove the sod before you put the bed down. I would do it that way. I would say it's up to you, but that's what I would do. And it's really, unless you're building a huge set of beds, it's not a big deal to strip that sod off. You can use a square-ended shovel pretty easily and cut it out and compost it and use it in your garden later on. And then often there's that question of whether you put a barrier at the bottom or not. So we'll just talk about that in a minute. So you can see a couple of beds here on different surfaces. Well, this is a video that I came across from this old house. Very nicely done, really quick. He just does in a short video, has his family out there and they build this bed right off the bat and tells you how to do it step by step. It's pretty impressive. No muss, no fuss, just get her done. And so what he did was he built that bed and then he had it sitting on the ground where he wanted the bed to be, cut around it with a shovel, then moved the bed off and used that dimensions that were cut out to strip the sod off, and there they are digging down into it. Now that bed is only 12 inches deep, so it makes sense to me that they would want to cultivate the soil so that you can garden, the crop can actually grow down into the soil. And so then what are you putting between the beds? Some people just leave it grass. Some people make it something else and it eventually returns to grass. But here's one that's been nicely mulched and it looks pretty nice. There is grass growing between these beds, and I know that there had been fabric down below them at one time, and that fabric has deteriorated and the grass just grew back again. What I've discovered, having done some gardening in some other places in Canada, I realized that quack grass is what we grow well here in Alberta, and grass in general. And so where in other places people just plunk a bed down on a lawn and it doesn't seem to be a problem, I find that it can be a bit of a challenge. So let's think about that. So back again, space between the beds, what are we doing? You want to be able to get your wheelbarrow down there, maybe you want your lawnmower down there. And for walking, so as somebody has pointed out, when you've got these tall raised beds, if you're putting big massive plants in there and your rows are very narrow, it can get difficult to get between the beds. So do account for needing that space as they sprawl a bit. These are some beautiful raised beds at the Olds College campus. If you are ever looking for gardening inspiration, the campus is a great place to go. And they've got these beautiful beds where they do a lot of annual flower trials. So again, you can see a nice design there, how they've put them together. They've put that nice flat ledge on the top so they're easy to sit on. And there is just kind of a gravel base around it and also a sidewalk in front of it. So there's no weeds growing in there. And also, just while we're looking at this photo, you can see those little black pieces sticking up out of the beds at the edges. That's part of an irrigation system. That is another nice addition you could put into a raised bed fairly easily to make the job easier. Okay. I guess I didn't really conclude that conversation about what goes at the bottom of the bed. So I would say, once again, it's your preference. If your bed is deep, maybe you don't need, you could put a base in it if you wanted. Black plastic, heavy plastic, lots of times people will do that. Some people put mesh underneath their beds so that creatures can't dig up through them into the bed. I would say that that's not often a big problem here. If you are living in the east end of the county and pocket gophers are a problem for you, that might be an issue, but often it's not. So my preference is to not put a bottom in it. It certainly limits you when you're digging if you're trying to dig down deep. And if the bed is shallow, be very cautious because you are inevitably going to cut through it. But sometimes people like to put a bottom in it, and if it just gradually rots away, or if it's plastic and it eventually comes apart, at least it's given you a few years of no weeds creeping in. So what are you going to put in there? Some people go to the soil store and buy a big truckload of garden mix. So that has got nice topsoil in it, some coarse sand, and compost. That is probably the primo mix and your most expensive choice. Some people choose to purchase topsoil, which is less expensive than the mix, and add their own compost or other materials. I was just talking to a horticulturist who's done a lot of work in his day, and he has used straight compost, which I would not have recommended, but he said that the municipality he lives in produces some great compost, and he's just put it straight up in the bed, and it's great to use. And then, so lasagna style, if any of you have built a lasagna garden, you'll be familiar with it. It's just layering a bunch of materials. And so that's what was done at the Multicultural Center when they renovated the beds. They started out with they took out all the old soil, got rid of the old frames, put new ones in, and they started with a thick layer of cardboard, corrugated cardboard. Then they kind of mashed up the old wood that was there, cut it into pieces. I think it was mostly rotten, and sprinkled it around in the bed. And then they put on 2 layers of the lasagna kind of mix. So that is a combination of brown material like leaves, dry leaves from last year, green material, which would be things like well-rotted manure. They used alfalfa pellets. It could be grass clippings. It could be household compost stuff that you put in the pail and take out to the yard. And just alternate that brown and green, and just noting that the brown materials could be straw. That is another good piece that we often have at hand. The brown materials are quite light and fluffy, so by volume you would use about 4 times as much of the brown as you would of the green. So that gets you a nice layer, and then you top it up with some nice topsoil on the top of the bed. What you don't want to add in your boxes is somebody that says, oh, I've got a great manure pile you're welcome to take away. And that manure pile is 20 years old. It's spectacular stuff, but it's been growing weeds on the top for 20 years. And it's run through with quackgrass. Don't bring that to your house. If it's beautiful compost or beautiful well-rotted manure that has been kept turned or maybe even covered, then that would be a fabulous thing to have. But do not bring home anybody else's weeds even if they're giving it to you for free. Okay, where is that best location? And don't think that because you've got a raised bed, it means you can now use a lousy gardening location. You need to have as nice a location for your raised bed as you would for an in-ground bed. And that means they need full sun. And it should be somewhere that you can get at easily to water it. This bed in the Multicultural Center, the whole set of beds, you can see that beautiful windbreak on the north side. That is lovely for blocking the cold wind that comes through early in the spring. And so that is very nice. And the other thing you can do with raised beds is if you've got a slope, there are many examples of beds that have been built in tiers and then sort of gradually work their way down the slope. So that can take a space that would be hard to garden in the ground, becomes quite easy in a raised bed. So just have a little look at those onions growing in the bed at the bottom. Can you see they all have a lean to them? They are in the row closest to the trees in the garden over that we're seeing on the right hand side, and they are leaning for some light. So trees will give you some nice shade, but or some nice shelter from the wind, but you don't want to get too close to them. Lots of people will build a small raised bed up against the south facing side of a building, and often it's the garage. So that's a space where not much is going on, so you might as well put a little bed there. This bed, first thing in the spring, gets planted and has a window over top of it so it heats up. And we all know how beautiful it is to eat those lush little green first plants of the spring when we're just so desperate for new vegetables. So again, close to water is a great thing to have. The garden on the right-hand side has got rain barrels that get filled up, and so water is easy at hand. And the tool shed is right there. Isn't that a clever idea from a repurposed outhouse? I think that's a brilliant kind of a garden. All right, what are we putting in these beds? We are putting just about anything. I would say I consider raised beds to be expensive space, so you should put your high value crops in there. So I would say tomatoes. Lots and lots of people grow tomatoes and grow things that you enjoy. No point in having beds that are growing things that you'd rather not have. So yeah, all sorts of things can go in there. I was interested in people planting potatoes in the raised beds at the community garden, and I quizzed the garden coordinator, and she said, oh, well, they plant the potatoes in those beds. At home, they have containers where they put their tomatoes. So it just depends on where your best spaces are for that particular crop. But if new potatoes are the thing you absolutely wait for, then that's a great crop to grow in your raised beds. So lots of greens do exceedingly well in beds. Be prepared to harvest them and then be ready to put another crop in once you've picked them. The lady with the bok choy has already harvested her first crop of radishes, and so she'll be ready to put some more, or probably has already seeded some more so that they're going to follow on after that. You can see a lot of vining crops in raised beds, cucumbers, squashes, all do nicely and can fill that space. And then they can spill over the sides, or they can be grown up on supports like these tomato cages. So corn, I've asked people, do you plant corn in your raised beds? And people have said yes, they like the heat. It seems to me that you maybe want more corn than that, but I would say it's not impossible. One of the tricks is it can get very tall, or it should get very tall if it's going to be successful. So if you've got another bed beside you, it can cast quite a bit of shade because of those tall plants. So think about that when you're planting. And there are lots of different strategies. Some people will plant their beds in blocks. Some people will plant them in straight rows like a conventional kind of a garden. And some people use this as their opportunity to just go all out for square foot gardening. And that's a very specific kind of a gardening method where you're planting a certain number of plants in each square foot. Depending on the kind of plant you're growing will tell you how many plants go in that space. And if you don't know anything about square foot gardening, Mel Bartholomew is the guy that invented it, and he's got a website with much information on that. And you can see one of the lovely advantages of raised beds can be that it's easy to attach supports of various sorts. And so I'm assuming there are something like peas or cucumbers in that back row that are going to grow up that trellis. Perennial crops, I often would say they maybe not be successful growing in a bed that's raised up because they're not right in the soil. But I've been clearly proven quite wrong. Lots of people have got perennial crops in their beds. Chives, I saw a lot of chives growing in them. Lots of herbs can overwinter in those beds. Gloria's got a whole bunch of glorious lilies growing in her bed, and they are overwintering nicely. I would say the problem then is that because the beds are raised and they freeze solidly right to the ground typically, and whereas plants that are planted right in the ground, although the soil gets cold and does freeze near the surface, it's not getting as cold as it might up above ground. And so it may be that some years when we get a particularly cold year, perennials that have survived nicely in a raised bed may not, all of a sudden they just don't come back the next year. So I would say go for it, give it a try. But maybe don't put all your strawberries in your raised bed, have some in the ground as well. And while you're at it, you might as well have a few other things in your raised bed gardens. Here's a little bowl with some water for the insects that are around in the garden, maybe helping with some pollinating, and a little pollinator house as well. So there are lots of things that can be added to the beds to make them even more useful. And so here's a nice bed on the left-hand side with a wire mesh on it. And I think that is field fence, like we stock fence. You go to the UFA, buy a 16-foot panel, cut it down to suit your size, stick it into the bed right down to the bottom, and you've got a very sturdy support that can grow cucumbers later on up and over. But in the spring, it's a great way to cover it over to warm that bed up ahead of time. Or you can be a little less permanent and just use PVC pipe and just shove it into the soil at the edges, and that makes a nice cover for your bed. So there's a few more examples. There's the floating row cover on the bed on the top left-hand corner. The bed on the bottom left-hand corner has got chicken wire around it. So I'm assuming that this gardener has got something that gets into the bed from time to time. This is a photo I took when I was in Ontario. Maybe they're keeping raccoons out of there. I'm not sure chicken wire would keep a raccoon out, but anyhow, easy way to just raise the level of the bed a little bit, or of the, put posts at the edges and wrap it around. The beds on the right-hand side are covered with fabric row cover, and I suspect that they've got plants planted in there now, and it is helping to raise the heat in there to warm up the bed. Or sometimes what people will do is cover the beds to get them warm before they plant them, take the cover off, and then plant them. So that can help warm things up a bit. And of course, crops like broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, Chinese cabbage are all troubled by the cabbage butterfly and the worm, and root maggots as well, and makes no difference whether the beds are raised or whether you're gardening in the ground. So this garden has got the hoops all around it, and then the row cover over top, and then a fairly ingenious, just a set of 2x4s and some clamps are holding it down nice and securely so that they don't blow off in the breeze. So that could be used for frost protection, or it could be used for insect protection. And the photo on the left-hand side is using an old dismantled greenhouse to make a frame, and she's got mesh on there, just a bird netting to keep the neighbors' cats out, and then little hot caps to warm up those vegetables. And so this is that nice long bed that we saw. So it has got a fence all the way around it. And is that keeping cats out, Gloria? Oh, it's for the chickens, keeping the chickens out. Okay. And also does double duty for growing peas up. So the peas can get planted at the back of the bed, and I'm assuming you can pick the peas from outside the raised bed. There you go. Think about how big the mesh is, and if it's big enough for you to get your hands through. Very clever. So now you are increasing the space on that bed. So this is a bed that you work at from just one side, and I can see a big advantage to that. I love the ideas people that come up with. Okay, so here's some little structures specifically designed for this raised bed, made with railway tie, or not railway ties, landscape ties, and just little tents for the broccoli that's in there to keep the cabbage butterflies out. And at the end of the season, they just get lifted off and easy to put away. And this large bed on the right-hand side is from Honey's greenhouse. She's got a lovely little display bed there and is using pallets. So that is what some plants grow up on there. It's a nice ornamental kind of a feature to the bed and gives it some structure as well. So of course there's ongoing maintenance, just the same as there would be in a regular bed. There would be some weeding to be done, and everybody that has a raised bed says it's so much easier in a raised bed because you just pick them. And I think to myself, well, we can do that in the ground as well, but for some reason maybe we don't. So if you're it can be a real advantage. You're starting out with nice loose soil, maybe nice clean soil, maybe that's the advantage, but it can be a fast job. Maybe it's just because you plain want to be out there, the beds are so pretty. Whatever it is, that can be an advantage. They do need to be watered. You could put up an irrigation system if you'd like. If you've got tall plants, they need to be staked, and the rule always is put those stakes in before the plants are flopping over and are in trouble. And you do need to keep working on the soil. You can't put in lovely soil and just garden in there year after year after year without doing anything to it. So adding organic matter, compost, well-rotted manure, peat moss, those things all need to happen, and some materials that are going to add fertility. Do monitor for insects and diseases, and there will be some repairs that are needed along the way. So there again, there's some different kinds of supports that you can use. And now you can just get a good close look at how that trellis in the square foot garden is put together. It's pretty simple. They've added a cross piece in the middle of the bed to attach the trellis to. And I love the nice sturdy tomato stakes. These would be indeterminate tomatoes. So these are the ones that get taller and taller rather than sprawling out so much. So that's a good choice when you're choosing a crop, is the indeterminate tomatoes rather than the bush type tomatoes. And you do need to fertilize them in some fashion. If you want lush, beautiful plants like this, after a few years of harvesting, you do need to replace those nutrients. So lots of different choices. Some people will top dress with compost. You can use fertilizer that is granular that you mix up with water and water it on. There are organic types, there are synthetic types, so use what works for you. Just don't ignore it, because you will get poorer and poorer yields off of it, and that's disappointing after all of the work that you've put into it. And so again, there does need to be some weeding. I think lots of us have seen raised beds that aren't being used anymore, and it feels kind of sad to see that. And I don't think it's any story based on that raised beds aren't great. I think it's just that they, like any garden, if it's not kept tended, they will come apart and they need to be fixed up. And I don't know how well putting up a sign offering free weeds works, but that bed looks pretty good, so maybe it does. Keep an eye on the plants. Here's a big, glorious zucchini spewing out, or maybe it's a squash, out of the bed, and it's got powdery mildew on it. So that is a bit of a hazard when you've got beds that are intensively planted, because they're very closely spaced. So catch it early. Maybe you need to do a little thinning out of some plants, or this is where your garden journal comes into play. You make some notes about what you planted, how many you put into the bed, and maybe next year you put fewer of them in there. And of course, something like powdery mildew is a little bit more likely to happen in wet, cool weather. So season to season, sometimes it changes. So there we've got a bed that's planted in conventional straight rows. And can you see that the soil is right up to the edge? I think that is important too. If you've gone to the trouble of building a bed to a height, keep the soil built up so that you've got that full height to garden in. And it will sink, especially in those first few years. So be prepared to keep adding more to it as you go. So here are just a few more ideas of beds just to finish off for the evening. Different designs. The tiered beds look very lovely. And this is a brand new bed. This bed on the right hand side was something I saw at an ecological garden where they were demonstrating lots of principles. So it's a long bed, almost like a trough, and it's like a plastic culvert that's in the bottom. I have a hunch that was maybe something that had been used for another purpose and maybe was no longer useful for that purpose, and they cut it in half all the way down and lengthwise and turned it into a beautiful raised bed. There would be holes drilled in the bottom, I'm assuming, so that there's some good drainage in there. And those beds may be even designed for people with mobility issues, that they can get right up to them. It was quite attractive. So talking about raising a raised bed, here's one that is up off the ground, so it's easy to work with. And along beside that bed, off the end of it, they've also built a little sink with a water reservoir at the top. This was on our beautification tour last year, and I must say it got lots of people circling around and taking photos thinking, oh, I need to have one of those in my garden with a little bucket at the bottom to collect the water as it runs out. Beautiful setup for washing up those, whatever you harvested out of the garden. So you will recognize on the left-hand side, that is one of those ubiquitous water tanks that so many people have in their yard that has been cut in half and a little ledge put around it so it's easy to sit in. And this particular bed was built for somebody's mother-in-law for Mother's Day. I thought that was a, a nice gift, and it has been quite a productive bed. This is a bed you may recognize as one of the planters at the Sundial Park in San Gudo, and it's made out of logs, so it's sitting right next to the little log cabin made out of logs, and that bed has been in use for many years. And now I recall it's lined with sheet metal, and so those logs have lasted quite a long time. Just trying to think, I just heard when that log house was built. It's 20 years, I think. And you can see the pea gravel around the side. That makes a nice barrier for weeds coming in. And when they get into the pea gravel, it's pretty easy to pick. So a keyhole design is something we hadn't talked about before, but that's another design that a lot of people are keen to use for raised beds. So having that little cut into it allows you to get access to the middle of the bed by having a much larger bed. So rather than it being long and narrow, that's a pretty clever design. And this bed on the left-hand side in the top right-hand corner, the same bed, and that also is a keyhole design, but it's got a little fence around it and a gate. They really didn't want anybody else in there except who's gardening. And that was a giveaway. Somebody said she was at work or something, and someone said they weren't using it anymore, so she brought it home, and it's growing those beautiful tomatoes. So I just wanted to acknowledge all of the people that had conversations with me about their raised beds, and there's lots to see. And the community garden even has one raised bed dedicated to a sandbox, which I think keeps the children happy while mom and dad are gardening. So that is a great plan. So I just will finish off by saying we will stop here, and if people have got some questions, we'll take them and have a bit of a discussion. But before you leave, wanted to let you know that we have got, the Mayerthorpe Library has got Mark Stumpf Allen coming. He is the coordinator of the compost program for the City of Edmonton, and he's going to just talk about everything you need to know about getting going on a good compost. He's got all the answers to any questions you might have. That's going to happen in July in this same kind of Zoom format. And stay tuned, keep an eye on the Mayerthorpe Library website, and you will get the details about when. And Mark is a great presenter. So I just wanted to say, if you have got some questions or if you have got some good advice to share, then we would invite you to turn your mic back on and tell us what you have to say. So turn your mic on, say what you have to say, mute your mic again, and then we can catch other people if you've got some comments to add.
Well, Lorraine, while everybody else gets unmuted so they can ask their questions, I have one, and that is about the patio block bed that Lee Valley sells. I'm wondering, do you think that dries out faster? It's the patio block set that you can buy from Lee Valley to make the raised bed. They had the clips and then I'm wondering if you think that would dry out faster.
Well, they would dry out if the bed is very narrow. I think it's no different than any other stone kind. So yeah, I think you're right. It will probably dry out more quickly than a wood bed would. But if you're prepared to keep it watered, because now you've got that advantage of it being nice and warm. Mm-hmm. And so a point that you make as well too, an advantage of having a wider bed is that it's got more mass of soil there, so it can hold more moisture, and the center of the bed is not going to dry out as quickly as everything at the edges. So the way you plant your bed would be a little bit based on which crops need more moisture. So it certainly would be a thing to think about for sure. Okay. The advantage of those patio blocks is it would be dead easy to build, right, you know, once you've got them dragged to your place, but yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Any advice about quackgrass?
Quackgrass.
Yes, if you get it into the bed, is there any way to get it out without resorting to chemicals, or do you just keep digging?
Okay, yeah. So I had that conversation with Jennifer Burns Robertson, who is the coordinator of the community garden in Stony Plain. And so you saw a couple of beds there that were just loaded with quackgrass, and those are beds that haven't been used for a few years. And her comment was, just dig it out. So first thing in the spring, just dig and dig and dig till you get all of it out that you can, and then throughout the year, just keep at it. I think it is the same as any garden. There's no quick fix. You just need to keep at it. So I guess I also would say on the raised beds and what you've got around the beds, that's my preference, is to have some kind of a mulch material. What I have just a couple of very small, like low raised beds in my garden, and I use grass clippings in there. So I just pack the grass clippings in right up against the bed for a width, maybe a foot width. And every time we mow, we just pack more on there. And that seems to slow it down. And anything that grows in, it has to grow into there before it can get into the bed.
Right.
And so it's usually a little easier to pull the grass out before it's actually into the bed. Because if it's growing in the bed, you know that it's come from below and it's made its way all the way up. So by that time, it's already got quite a root system on it.
Right.
So I think don't let it get in the first place, and then be persistent when it is there.
Okay, thank you, Lorraine.
I just, compost is all I've got. I don't have a lot of black soil. It got scraped off when they built here. So I do use compost, but I use it because we went to several years, we had these really nice barbecues where we had a whole bunch of lobsters. They were kind of exotic, and it was just kind of like really nice. When they wanted to haul all of the lobster shells out to the bush, I said, no, you can't do that. And I got all of these barrels, many barrels of lobster shells over 2 or 3 years that I buried in my pile of manure from the sheep. Well, very old manure. And it is exactly like you said, well weeded if you get the top stuff. However, if you really kind of work at it, and you can go in at the sides and uncover it. But I just say I've had lots of people helping me, in the garden over the years. And they pull out these very weird looking, what is this? But it's really good. It was too good to turn down. I mean, I come from people who use seaweed and dead fish heads and all sorts of things in gardens because we were near the sea. So sometimes you have to use manure.
Sure, good example, Lynette. I still turn up small bones of sheep in my compost too.
Exactly. I didn't think this was the place to mention that, but yeah, and baling fine. So I haven't opened it up. Lots of people are looking for soil for their gardens. They want this black soil. I don't know where we get black soil in this area, really. It's kind of clay, isn't it? And
yeah, there are companies that sell soil, so that's a good place to go.
Oh, that costs money though, yeah.
It does. Oh, I see. Okay. Well, look in the local ads. Often you'll see notices in local ads for people selling topsoil.
Yeah, but still, it's what you've got to use. It's like recycling. My point is that yes, the weeds are there, but if you work at it for a few years, like the thistles are probably the worst because they seed on top, and dandelions. Well, I'll take those any day over that horrible quackgrass. So
yeah,
it's to me, it's not hard to go in and weed a few times. Anyway, that's my
great. Thank you.
I thought I would just share with you the library's resource Hoopla. So this is a great place to go for ebooks and e-audio books right now when you can't access your library. And so while we were doing this demonstration, I just thought I'd just take a look in there and see if there was anything there for us. I see that you can get the Square Foot Gardening book. When I look for raised beds, oops, sorry, I'm using my laptop and I'm not don't regularly use this one. I can find all kinds of stuff in here. There's loads and loads of gardening resources. All you need to get started is your library card and your PIN. If you don't have a library card, right now is a great time to get one because they are being offered for free from all our local libraries. Go to their website, have a look in there, and you'll find a form that you can fill out and they will set you up with a free card. And I think if nobody else has questions, I think we're done for tonight. Thank you so much, Lorraine.